this is the topic we're going to be tackling today. And the guest for today is the one, the only, Matt Huber, professor of geography at Syracuse University and longtime critic of the degrowth tendency on the left. You have a new article in Jacobin, a relatively new article in Jacobin, where you are tackling this article. If people are interested, it's called "The Problem with Degrowth." You'll find the link in the description. And this is one of sort of a number of interventions that Professor Huber has made into this quite contentious debate, which most recently seems to have been triggered by the banana discussion and the subsequent banana split that occurred on the left. So welcome to This is Revolution, Professor Huber.
Thank you for having me.
So, as I said at the outset, you have been a critic of degrowth in a general sense, although I would note at the beginning of your article, you do concede some, let's say, second order points to the degrowthers in terms of perhaps some of their policy descriptions, et cetera, some of the needs of society. But you have a kind of meta critique of this phenomenon of degrowth. So as a starting point, how would you describe degrowth as a tendency on the left? I know we have like liberal versions of it, but what is the left-wing version of the degrowth argument?
Yeah, and what I should say is that the article came out of a Twitter thread that was responding to a new issue of the sort of legendary Marxist journal Monthly Review. The first issue published Albert Einstein, What is Socialism? Or maybe Why Socialism? And anyway, the whole issue is devoted to what they call eco-socialist degrowth and planned degrowth. As you said, I've been a longtime critic of degrowth, and sometimes I wonder why I keep trying to articulate this critique, because it's but when socialists and Marxists even are gonna basically embrace the banner of degrowth, I feel like kind of compelled to keep trying to carve out a Marxist position that does not embrace this degrowth. So in any event, this sort of version of eco-socialist degrowth is, coming from a very correct analysis that we're facing a very serious ecological crisis, and that the cause of that crisis is capitalism, and that a solution to that crisis would require fundamentally reorienting the economy toward ecological sustainability and meeting human needs. And so most degrowthers now have really embraced, I would say, a quite non-austerity position that, like the economy should guarantee survival, it should guarantee people's basic needs, whether it be healthcare, housing, energy, these types of things. But because the sort of framework is sort of couched in this idea of degrowth, they do kind of say, yes, we want to do this, but that means, because of the science is saying about like planetary boundaries or the climate crisis, that we can actually restructure the economy in a way to meet human needs, but also reduce aggregate material throughput or reduce energy use in rich countries, or sort of orient the program over some kind of aggregate reduction of production and consumption, which ultimately I think lends itself to a perspective that believes that really the capitalist industrial economy is sort of fully developed, and all we really need to do is kind of redistribute the existing productive capacity to kind of meet human needs, solve the ecological crisis, which, as I tried, I hope I'm not going off into too many different directions, but as I try to articulate in the article, a more standard Marxist position is that capitalism actually really restricts our development of what Marx called the productive forces, or of production generally. It restricts it to what is profitable, what is can make investors money on the market. And also, the market itself is this sort of constraining, competitive compulsion of forces that really restricts society's productive capacity in all these ways. And actually, a more standard Marxist analysis would say that, like, actually it's capitalism and the profit motive in markets that are preventing us from solving the ecological crisis, because preventing us from developing a lot of new technologies and solutions that really we already know exist, but that they're just not profitable to develop the scale. And so what I try to articulate in the article is that we don't need to subscribe to this degrowth perspective, which is at the core of its politics and demands, sort of says we need some sort of aggregate reductions, but that we should be way more flexible. If we're going to take over the economy, we need to grow a lot of stuff that poor people need, the working class needs, and that the environment needs. But we need to degrow bad stuff. And when you talk to degrowthers, they often say, "Well, yeah, I agree with that." But really, what we're talking about is socialism, and that's really about collective democratic control over production. And there's I don't see any reason to sort of like hinder how we frame that control to sort of already bake into these aggregate reductions. When I think, again, the science on planetary boundaries is a little, it's highly debated by scientists, but we do know, for instance, that there's one planetary boundary that we're coming up against on climate, and it's, we're emitting too much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But what I try to point out is that the solution to that planetary boundary is not degrowth. It's actually going to require a massive development of the productive forces to shift us away from fossil fuels, create totally new technology, totally new energy. It's actually going to require a massive increase in production to solve this problem, what some have called kind of industrial revolution. So anyway, each planetary boundary is like a contextual problem that would require sort of transforming a specific way of producing things. And, this sort of aggregate degrowth doesn't make a lot of sense in my opinion.
What you just said reminds me, I mean, I think it was a year ago, maybe even a year and a half ago, we had Zach Exley on, who was,
interesting,
who's one of the, kind of minds behind the Green New Deal project, as I'm sure you were. And, he put it in a very interesting way. He says, to save the environment, we need to build millions of machines to take apart millions of other machines to solve these problems. But I want a little clarification for people out there about when we talk about growth versus degrowth. And this concept of growth in general. I think people get confused because different tendencies are within politics have different conceptions of what quote unquote growth is. So obviously the metric that is most commonly used today is GDP, right?
Yeah.
And I think both you and the degrowthers would agree GDP is just not a really good measurement of the question of growth.
Absolutely.
So the debate that you're having with the degrowthers, can you just elaborate what you mean by growth if we're not talking about GDP?
So, I think the degrowth movement comes out of a reaction to our society, our capitalist society, which is sort of obsessed with growth as measured by GDP. The press will constantly, I think we're getting numbers on our GDP soon, or we just got them. And, like this obsession with, the economy is seen as being healthy if GDP growth is going up. And there's a sort of sense that our economy needs GDP growth in some way. I think this is sort of an obfuscation, that the economy under capitalism doesn't need growth in this abstract sense. It needs capital to profit, right? And you need to accumulate that capital into further capital accumulation. And if that's happening, you tend to see GDP growth as this sort of indirect statistical approximation of a healthy capitalist economy. But in my view, sort of because we've got this sort of ideological obsession with GDP growth in our society, the degrowthers call it a kind of growthism, like this sort of ideological fixation on growth. that what degrowth tries to do is sort of like, well, we're going to negate that fixation and say, well, actually what we need is the opposite of that, which is degrowth. And in many ways, as you said, like, they are correct that GDP as a measurement of growth does not really measure well society's well-being, certainly does not measure whether or not we're treating the environment particularly well. And we do need to move away from a society that sort of lionizes and worships this measurement of GDP growth. And we need, and people have been doing this for years. There was once when I was growing up something called the genuine progress indicator, where they tried to develop a new statistical measure that kind of takes into account things that matter a lot more, like education, healthcare, environmental well-being into these numbers. But what I would say is, as a socialist, obviously if we seize the means of production and had a collective democratic control over the economy, we're not going to measure social well-being through this GDP thing. We're gonna institute something like that different measure of progress, whether it's quantitative or not. And again, I don't see any reason why that socialist society should not want some sort of growth of lots of things that society needs. Like you just said, all those machines we need to solve climate change. But also what I point out in the article is, like, we actually still live in an incredible situation of poverty for many around the world. Nearly about 800 million people on the planet have zero access to electricity. Billions of people really suffer from hunger. Billions of people don't have just basic water sanitation services that we take for granted. So, a socialist society would want to deliver that kind of, access to these basic amenities as like a human right. And to me, that would require a tremendous amount of growth of productive investment and infrastructure. And so it's not clear to me why this new socialist society has to embrace this idea that we're going to sort of decrease or reduce in some aggregate way. Socialist growth would be very different than capitalist growth. It would be growth in human freedom and growth in, human potential and growth in democratic control and all this sort of stuff. But what we shouldn't do is let capitalists and capital and capitalism monopolize the notion of growth. We want a society that grows in other qualitatively important ways. And just because capitalism has created this kind of really unhealthy obsession with its own very narrow construction of growth doesn't mean we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, I guess I'd say.
So